We like to think we know our neighbours, that the quiet streets we live on are safe, that behind every curtain is a family just like ours, ordinary, peaceful, harmless. But the truth is, we rarely know what goes on behind closed doors. Sometimes those doors hide heartbreak, sometimes they hide monsters, and sometimes they hide something so unimaginable. It shakes the very idea of what it means to be human. Today's story began with a mistake. One morning in early November 1970, a nearly blind woman stepped into a Los Angeles County welfare office. She was seeking help, not for her child, but for herself. She was disorientated, struggling to navigate with cataracts clouding one eye and total blindness in the other. Holding one hand was her elderly mother. In the other, she led a small, strange girl, silent, hunched and pale. She had meant to find the office for the blind. She walked into social services instead. And in doing so, she changed everything. The eligibility worker on duty couldn't look away from the child. She was tiny, frail, with a stooped posture and an odd shuffling walk. Her arms were bent in front of her, as if resting on something invisible. She didn't speak, and she barely moved. At first, the worker thought she might be autistic, maybe 6 or 7 years old, but something felt wrong, very wrong. A supervisor was called, questions were asked, and what happened next over the next few hours would become one of the most disturbing cases of child abuse ever recorded. The girl wasn't 6 years old, she was 13, and her name was Genie. She weighed just 59 pounds, she couldn't chew, couldn't cry, couldn't speak more than a few broken words. Her body was twisted, her muscles barely worked, her mind was a mystery. Police would soon discover that she had spent most of her life locked in a single dark room, tied to a potty chair during the day and confined in a sleeping bag at night. And it had been her father that had hidden her away from the world. But now the silence was broken when headlines exploded 3 weeks later. Girl 13, prisoner since infancy. And the world wanted answers. Who was this child? What had been done to her? And now that she was free, could she ever reclaim the life that had been stolen from her? This is a case of Genie Wiley.
Officials in the Los Angeles suburb of Arcadia have taken custody of a 13-year-old girl in such isolation by her parents that she never even learned to talk. The girl reportedly was still wearing diapers when the social worker discovered the case 2 weeks ago.
The indications are that she was beaten for making noise.
Like almost every tragedy, this one did not begin with the victim. Before the girl known as Genie ever came into the world, the forces that would shape her life were already in motion, woven into the complicated histories of her parents. Her father, Clark, grew up in Pacific Northwest. He was shuffled through foster homes and orphanages, and he had lived a childhood defined by abandonment, rules, and silence. Her mother, Irene, came from Altus, Oklahoma, a place battered by the Dust Bowl. a period of severe dust storms that devastated the agricultural regions of the Great Plains in the United States during the 1930s. It was a time where survival meant sacrifice and tenderness was often in short supply. She spent much of her childhood being passed between relatives and family friends, and the people that she called her mother and father had raised multiple generations, including Irene's own father, when he too had been cast out as a boy. Irene's early years were far from safe. One memory stands out: a washing machine incident that left her with lasting neurological damage, a trauma that would later contribute to her blindness in one eye. Another memory: watching men pass the house carrying empty buckets. When she asked her mother where they were going, she was told to the soup line. We're lucky we still have food. Eventually, though, that luck did run out. Irene's family packed up what little they had and headed west, chasing the dream of a better life in California. But like so many others, they found that the promised land was already full. By the time she was in her 20s, Irene had few options and fewer opportunities. So when she met Clark, 20 years her senior, behind a soda fountain at a Hollywood drugstore, marriage must have seemed like an escape. But unfortunately for Irene, it wasn't. It would become a living nightmare. Clark was strict, controlling, and possessive. Irene would later say that her life ended the day that she married him. He didn't want any children. They were too noisy, he would say. When she became pregnant 5 years into their marriage, Clark beat her so badly that she was hospitalised. While in treatment, she went into labour. The baby girl luckily was born healthy, but her cries enraged Clark. She was placed into the garage. 2 months later, she was dead. Irene said it was pneumonia that killed her baby girl. The truth was likely exposure. The second child the two had soon died after birth, the result of RH blood poisoning. Their third child, a boy, survived but was neglected to the point of developmental delay. He wasn't walking or toilet trained by age 3. Only when his paternal grandmother took him in for several months did he actually begin to recover. In 1957, a fourth child was born, a daughter. She too had RH blood poisoning, but a transfusion saved her life. The girl, like her older brother, fell behind in every way, but this time nobody came to help. And then came the final break. In 1958, everything changed forever. Clark's mother, the woman he had adored despite a fractured, tumultuous past, was struck down in a hit and run as she crossed the street holding her grandson's hand. The driver, a reckless teenager who barely faced punishment, received nothing more than probation. That injustice broke something deep inside Clark, and he never truly recovered. He walked away from his job, from the life he knew, and dragged his family into the cramped, dim house on Golden West Avenue that had belonged to his mother. There, behind heavy curtains drawn tight, he sealed his family off from the world. The man who had once had a brilliant mind for numbers, the man who smiled in old photographs, full of hope and promise, faded into a ghostly shadow. His life became a slow descent into silence and isolation. No visitors came, no questions were asked. And their children, especially the youngest, lived under a suffocating regime of control and neglect. Within those walls, on that quiet street, a child grew up without words, without play, without light. No one outside knew and no one looked close enough to see. Irene's world was closing in around her like a vice. Her eyesight failed rapidly, leaving her nearly blind and utterly vulnerable to the man who tormented her day after day. Their son was allowed only brief glimpses of the outside world, escapes to school or the neighbour's house, but was otherwise trapped within the prison of these four walls. He slept on a thin pallet in the living room, where his parents also lived. His mother huddled on the floor, his father slumped in a battered armchair. The main bedroom remained untouched, preserved as a shrine to Clark's late mother, a silent monument to the past that still haunted him. But it was his youngest daughter, barely 20 months old when they moved into that house, who bore the full, brutal weight of Clark's twisted sense of protection. He appointed himself guardian of the family, convinced his daughter was profoundly disabled, fragile, and vulnerable to the cruelties of the outside world. But what he never realised was that the greatest cruelty was the one he inflicted himself. Early medical reports had labelled the girl as slow, a victim of a failed blood transfusion. Upon hearing this diagnosis, Clark clung to it like a lifeline, twisting it into an obsessive delusion that justified his iron grip on her life. His protection became a nightmare. In her small bedroom, Genie was confined to a child's potty chair. She was strapped tightly into a homemade harness sewn by Clark himself. She was naked except for the cruel bindings. She sat immobilised, able to wiggle only her fingers and toes. Hour after hour, day after day, month after month, year after year, she remained tethered there, sometimes through the night. When Genie was freed from the harness at bedtime, she was wrapped in a makeshift sleeping bag designed to hold her arms still, like a straitjacket. Her cot was lined with wire mesh, a cage within a cage, enclosing her in silence and solitude. The house was unnervingly quiet. Clark's intolerance for noise turned the home into a sanctuary of hushed whispers and fearful silence. Genie heard almost no language. There were no lullabies, no whispered stories, no laughter or music. Only the faint echoes of the bathroom and occasionally the distant drone of traffic through a cracked window. When hunger or loneliness compelled Genie to make a sound, Clark responded with merciless blows from a large wooden stick left in the corner of her room. A grim instrument of punishment for Genie breaking her silence, so she learned to be still. Her room was stark and bare, no carpets, no pictures, just salmon-coloured walls, a dim ceiling bulb, a small closet, and 2 windows mostly shrouded in shadow. Genie's world was shaped not by joy or exploration, but by control. Even her rare toys were filtered through her father's warped lens of morality and fear. She was sometimes handed heavily edited pages from the TV listings, with images her father deemed too suggestive, like women in swimsuits or smiling models in advertisements. They were all carefully torn out, leaving behind fragmented scenes and blank spaces. These censored scraps became Genie's picture books. Alongside them, she was given the occasional empty cottage cheese container or discarded thread spoon. They were not toys in any real sense, but for Genie, they became everything. Her meals were limited to baby cereals and soft eggs. These were fed quickly and often forcibly. If she choked or refused a bite, Clark would rub the food harshly into her face. a cruel lesson in obedience and submission. Clark was certain that Genie would die young. He promised Irene that if their daughter survived past the age of 12, she could finally seek help. But when Genie turned 13, still alive, still trapped, Clark shattered his promise. Irene, almost blind and consumed by terror, was forbidden to reach out to her own family under threat of death. She was a prisoner herself, completely powerless. Only after a desperate and furious confrontation, when she threatened to flee unless Clark contacted her parents, did he finally relent. The same day, Irene gathered what little strength she had left, took Genie by the hand and stepped out from the shadow of the house that had been their prison, out into a world that neither of them truly knew. Susan Curtis would later recount the turning point, the day Genie was finally discovered, how police intervened, how the parents were arrested and charged with felony child abuse, how the girl, malnourished and mute, was taken to the hospital in a daze, leaving behind the only world she had ever known. There was a quiet sense of triumph in Curtis's words, like the closing line of a Dickens novel. She had been discovered at last. But the true closing chapter of that grim household was written not by the courts or by the scientists who would study Genie in years to come. It was written by Clark. On the morning of November the 20th, 1970, the day he and Irene were scheduled to appear in court to answer for their crimes against their daughter, Clark would go on to take his own life. He left behind 2 notes nearby. Clark claimed that the world would never understand. It read like a curse, a desperate attempt to defend the years of silence, cruelty, and domination that had defined his life. Back in court, Irene was already seated when the judge called her case. Her lawyer pleaded not guilty on her behalf, citing years of abuse and coercion at the hands of her husband. The judge received a message. The attorneys were summoned to the chambers. When Irene's counsel returned, he sat beside Irene and quietly told her that her husband was dead. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She just sat there, completely silent. And the passing of Clark, broadcast across network television, it was detailed in the next day's headlines, and it did nothing to diminish the public's obsession with the story. Outside Children's Hospital of Los Angeles, reporters and cameramen gathered, hoping to get a glimpse of the girl whose silence had shaken a nation. Inside, Genie was no longer tethered to a potty chair. She wasn't caged, beaten, or force-fed. She was free. For the first time in Genie's life, she was in a place built to protect children, not imprison them. A place equipped to handle her trauma and guard her fragile, delayed development. Though the neighbourhood around Children's Hospital was far from wealthy, the hospital itself had served the sons and daughters of Hollywood's elite. And now, in its halls, was a child unlike any other. A girl who had been hidden from the world for 13 years. To the doctors, the linguists, the psychologists, and the growing army of specialists, Genie wasn't just a patient, she was a mystery, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Irene relinquished custody of her daughter, agreeing to make Genie a ward of the state. At Children's Hospital, doctors began to uncover just how much damage had been done to the girl behind the headlines. Genie was 13 years old, but her body told a different story. She weighed just 59 pounds and stood barely 4.5 feet tall. She was incontinent, unable to chew or properly swallow food due to never having been given solid food her entire life. She drooled constantly, spat without control, and often urinated when startled or overstimulated. Her eyes could not focus beyond a dozen feet. What need had she ever had to look further than the four walls of her prison-like room? She had 2 sets of teeth, as her baby teeth had never fallen out. Her hair hung in thin patches and her limbs moved stiffly, unnaturally. She was unable to fully extend after years of restraint. She could not skip, hop, or run. She showed no clear response to heat or cold. She never cried, and she was completely unable to relate to humans. Though she understood a handful of simple words such as mother, blue, walk, door, she could not string together sentences. The few words that she could say came out in short, fractured bursts. She also acted out in sexually inappropriate ways at times, especially towards older men. This led doctors to believe that she may have also been sexually abused by her father. Genie was placed under the care of Dr. James Kent, a young psychologist tasked with assessing the extent of the damage done to this child, who had spent over a decade in near total isolation. Nothing could have prepared him for what he encountered. Her emotional range was muted and uneven. She could express only the barest fragments of human feeling, fear, confusion, anger, but even these were turned inwards. When overwhelmed, she didn't cry or scream. Instead, she would scratch at her own face or wet herself in silence. She had no words for how she was feeling. She had never been given the tools. Yet, almost immediately, something began to stir in Genie. By the 3rd day at the hospital, she was helping dress herself. She started using the toilet. Her progress, though fragile, was astonishing. To the staff who surrounded her, each small victory was monumental. A few months into Genie's stay, Genie lashed out for the first time. Not at herself, but at another child. A girl had worn a dress Genie recognised as one she used to wear, and Genie responded with a hitting gesture. It was the first time she had directed anger outwards, and her therapist saw it not as violence, but as a powerful, long-suppressed signal. She was beginning to understand her own place in the world. She began collecting objects, books, scraps, anything she could call her own. Her hoarding behaviour, though concerning on the surface, was interpreted as a promising sign. She was developing a sense of self. One day, as James Kent prepared to leave after a session, Genie gently took his hand and held on. She didn't want him to go. The simple act, wordless but full of meaning, marked a turning point. Genie was forming bonds she was beginning to trust. She was learning to make noises to signal things that she wanted. She learned to be more affectionate. She began hugging people she liked in the hospital. She learned how to smile. Genie's verbal skills never became so profound that she was writing essays, but she did begin to shed light on her upbringing. She would tell a therapist, "Father hit arm, big wood, Genie cry, not spit. Father hit face, spit. Father hit big stick. Father is angry. Father hit Genie big stick. Father take a piece wood hit, cry. Father make me cry." Over the following months, Genie underwent extensive cognitive and psychological testing. Her development was erratic, scattered. In some areas, she gained the equivalent of a year's development in just a few weeks. She could now bathe herself to the level of a typical 9-year-old, yet in others, like chewing food, she remained at the developmental level of a toddler. Her ability to speak remained severely limited, but she had stopped flinching from human touch and she had started to play. Day trips outside the hospital became her favourite outings. To Genie, the world was brand new. Streets, colours, trees, toys, people, it was all thrilling. Strangers would offer Genie gifts. She was enchanting even without words. Some who worked with her believed she was communicating on a level that transcended speech. Susan Curtis, the linguist who would become one of Genie's closest observers, spoke of a mysterious energy in Genie, what she described as an almost telepathic sensitivity. Genie became especially attached to plastic items. Her prized possessions were 23 plastic beach buckets of varying colours, which she kept close to her hospital bed. Her obsession was more than a quirk, it was rooted in the only joy she had ever known in her earliest years. Back in her bleak childhood room, 2 cheap plastic raincoats had been her only toys. In her new life, plastic became a symbol of comfort and play. Perhaps most remarkable of all, Genie began to show early signs of empathy. She was slowly learning that other people had thoughts, needs, and viewpoints different from her own. She was breaking out of the closed loop of egocentrism, a process that typically happens in the age group of 2 to 7. It was clear that while so much had been lost, not all was beyond reach. There were windows in Genie's mind still open, small, but letting in the light. After Genie's rescue, Genie became a symbol of both hope and controversy. To some, she was a miraculous survivor of unthinkable cruelty. To others, she became a rare, almost mythical scientific opportunity. But to a growing number of professionals around her, Genie wasn't just a child in need, she was a prize. There had been a fierce debate about the nature of language acquisition in the scientific community, and specifically, whether humans could develop language and communication in the absence of it. Genie was an extremely unique case in the study of nature in childhood development. While the world saw a tragic victim, the scientific community saw something else. A once-in-a-lifetime case study, and with that came competition. Arguments broke out about Genie's care, her future, and her body. Should her therapy come first or her value as a research subject? Would studying Genie help countless other neglected children, or was it just exploitation dressed up as science? Genie was subjected to an intense and prolonged series of scientific tests meant to study her brain and language development, but the process itself may have caused further harm. After her rescue, researchers from various fields, including linguistics, psychology, and neurology, conducted repeated exams. Neurolinguistic assessments, sleep studies, audiometry tests, and brain scans. These were designed to understand how her brain functioned after years of extreme isolation and language deprivation. While some of these tests revealed fascinating insights, such as the unusual dominance of her right hemisphere for language processing, they also treated Genie more like a research subject than a person. A woman named Jean Butler, one of Genie's first teachers, began to question the morality of Genie's treatment. After caring for Genie during a rubella quarantine, Butler grew fiercely protective of Genie. She began clashing with the so-called Genie team, a group of researchers that included Susan Curtis, David Ridgler, and others. Butler felt Genie was being over-tested and that her recovery was being sacrificed for data collection. In turn, the team believed Butler wanted to be the sole hero of Genie's story. Butler eventually demanded Curtis be removed from Genie's life, and when that failed, she applied to become Genie's foster parent. The request was denied, citing hospital policy against placing patients in staff homes. But soon, that same policy was overturned for someone else. Dr. David Ridgler, chief psychologist at the hospital, offered to take Genie in temporarily. That temporary arrangement lasted 4 years. Living with the Ridglers, Genie experienced something resembling a home. But the road was anything but smooth. She often acted out, spitting, hoarding objects, even defecating in unusual places. She took other children's belongings. In many ways, she was still learning what it meant to be human. There were signs of joy too. She discovered a deep love for classical music, especially the piano. It was believed that a neighbour's piano lessons had been her only source of regular sound during her years of isolation. Now, that music seemed to awaken something inside her. She responded with awe, focus, and happiness. Genie learned to iron, to sew. She began drawing to express what words still could not. In Gestalt tests measuring one's ability to perceive the whole from fragmented parts, Genie scored higher than anyone in published literature. One sunny afternoon, while out shopping, she turned to Curtis with a rare, beaming smile and said, "Genie happy?" Meanwhile, Genie's mother, Irene, had regained her sight back following cataract surgery and returned to her home on Temple Avenue. She began visiting Genie, but never felt truly welcome at the Ridglers. Over 4 years, she was only invited to their home 3 times. She began to resent the scientists, feeling judged, alienated, and dismissed. Irene never admitted any fault for Genie's early abuse, and many researchers questioned how much she truly knew, or chose not to know. It's quite important to mention that before Irene actually went and got help for Genie, she hadn't seen her daughter for 2 years, even though she was in the same house. Irene's closest ally was Jean Butler, who had grown increasingly vocal in her criticism of Genie's treatment. She claimed that Genie had deteriorated under the Ridglers' care, not improved. By 1975, their concerns seemed to gain weight. There was a research grant in place that had funded Genie's care, and the money had run out. Progress had slowed down dramatically. Despite the immense attention surrounding her case, very little academic work had been published. Ridgler admitted his work had been mostly anecdotal, not rigorous by scientific standards, and without funding, he could no longer support Genie. Within a month, Genie was sent away. In a shocking decision, Genie was returned to live with her mother. She was sent back to the very home where her trauma had begun. Unsurprisingly, it didn't work, and Irene, now in her late 60s and struggling to cope, quickly gave up custody again. And so social services placed Genie in a new foster home. Her new caregivers ran the house like a military camp, rigid, punitive, and cold. Genie, who had begun to blossom, regressed deeply. Faced with this new form of control, she began shutting down again. She stopped speaking, she refused to go to the toilet, and she would hold in her feces for days. The incident with the strongest impact on Genie occurred when her foster parents severely beat her for vomiting and told her that if she did it again, they would never let her see her mother, making her terrified of opening her mouth for fear of vomiting and facing more beatings. This in turn made her extremely frightened of eating or speaking, and she became extremely withdrawn and almost exclusively relied on sign language for communication. It was abuse again. Genie remained in that home for 18 months. Susan Curtis, now no longer receiving any funding for her work with Genie, was one of the few people that actually stayed in her life. Their bond was strong, and Curtis was horrified by what Genie was enduring. Eventually, she persuaded authorities to admit her back into Children's Hospital. But by then, Genie was malnourished, emotionally withdrawn, and developmentally stalled. What had once been the promise of healing had turned into a tragic cycle of abandonment and harm. The Genie team fell apart. One by one, the scientists drift away, some with regret, others with shame. Many refused to speak of the case again. J. Shirley, the man who had once warned that Genie might be pulled apart by competing interests, offered a damning summary. She was exploited, he said, by all of us. There was no villain, there was no manual, there was only a child and a world that didn't know how to love her properly. After years of being observed and studied, Genie was quietly placed into a private care home for adults with severe learning difficulties. Her mother, Irene, who became Genie's legal guardian once she had reached the age of 18, cut off all access from scientists, most notably Susan Curtis, who was devastated and continued to miss Genie deeply. For a time, Genie visited Irene on weekends, but in 1987, Irene sold her house and disappeared without leaving a forwarding address. She is believed to have died in California in 2003, and with that, Genie vanished from public view. In 2008, Genie's brother, John Wiley, spoke publicly for the first time. Now living in Ohio, he recalled the torment of their shared childhood and how he had run away at 18, just after Genie was found. Though he was also a victim, frequently beaten by their father, he admitted to feeling guilt and shame over not protecting her. John led a troubled life afterward, including brushes with the law and a failed marriage. He reported that Genie was living in a good care facility in Southern California. He said that she could say some words and had relearned parts of sign language, but John hadn't seen her since 1987. Dr. J. Shirley visited Genie on her 27th and 29th birthdays. He found her chronically institutionalized, withdrawn, stooped, and depressed. She made little eye contact and barely spoke. It seemed she had experienced the world briefly, only to be locked away once more. Genie's case lends partial support to the critical period hypothesis, which suggests that language must be acquired between early childhood and puberty. Genie was able to learn some words after this window, but she never developed grammar, the hallmark of true language, according to Chomsky. In the end, Genie's case remained inconclusive. She became the centre of fierce ethical debates in psychology about the limits of research, the responsibilities of scientists, and what happens when a vulnerable child becomes a subject of study. Her story is, above all, a tragedy, marked by failure after failure, both personal and institutional. Yet, despite everything, Genie reached out to others. She discovered joy and she showed remarkable resilience. she is remembered not only as a psychological case study, but as a powerful reminder of the human spirit's ability to endure. As of 2016, Genie remained a ward of the state of California, living in a private care facility in Los Angeles. Her exact whereabouts have never been made public. Those who have seen her describe a quiet life, simple and sheltered. She reportedly speaks only a few words, but still communicates using sign language. After everything she endured, perhaps peace and anonymity are the best protection that she has. Susan Curtis, who once fought to stay in Genie's life, has not been able to reach her in years. Her efforts to reconnect have been blocked. Genie, once the centre of international fascination, has faded back into silence. But her legacy endures, not just in the books and papers written about her, but in the uncomfortable questions her story raised about science, ethics, trauma, resilience, and the true cost of being human. It's deeply disturbing to realise that after years of surviving unimaginable abuse, Genie was rescued, only to be failed all over again. While her case presented a rare opportunity for scientific study, the obsession with research often seemed to overshadow her humanity. Genie wasn't just a subject, she was a person, a child who needed healing, love, and protection. Had the adults around her focused less on competing theories and more on consistent care, perhaps she could have made even more greater strides in communication. Above all, I just hope that wherever Genie is now, she is at peace. I hope she is safe and free from pain, surrounded by kindness, and living with the dignity she was denied for so long. She deserves nothing less, but most importantly, I just hope that she knows love.